Let's talk about Roger Kibbe, the I-5 Strangler, who was arrested, convicted for over 12 homicides, where he would rape, strangle, sometimes stab his victims, some as young as 17 years old, up and down the highways of California. In an ironic twist of fate, Roger Kibbe, dubbed the I-5 Strangler, would be strangled to death by his cellmate and have a pentagram carved in his chest, all done in his protective custody unit in Mule Creek State Prison in California. His cellmate was no good. However, it just shows you that time doesn't exist in prison, only opportunity. Sometimes guys in protective custody will try to get that bad name off them and take out one of these motherfuckers that they have access to. Because as we know, these serial killers, these child molesters, these predators, when they get locked up, the killing stops, the victimizing stops, and they become the victims every single time. It doesn't matter if you're in protective custody, if you're on the main line, eventually it's gonna be your time to pay for what you did. Now this man went up and down Interstate 5 and many other places, strangling, raping, stabbing the most helpless women, side of the road, sex workers, even doing job interviews where he killed them, put them in a false sense of security. And just as he led his victims into a false sense of security, that's ultimately what would happen to him. The universe has a funny way of working itself out. Boudreaux, who strangled him and carved the pentagram in his chest, his only concern was he didn't want people to think that he liked this dude. He lured him into a false sense of security after months and months of manipulating him to become his cellmate, where he would strangle him. Now let's go down the road, this dark road that led to Roger Kibbe being strangled in his prison cell after 12 convictions of multiple strangulations, rapes, all women. Roger Kibbe, born in 1940, started a furniture building company. He was also a parachutist with over 1,000 jumps. He would later find some of that cord that he did his parachute jumps with, used to bound and kill some of his victims. His brother, also ironically, was a detective, a homicide detective in California. Some say that he helped him get away with some of the murders, as 4 times he was investigated for killing and abducting his youngest victim, a 17-year-old. As well, when all this was happening from 77 to late 87, they would put stings all over California with detectives pretending to be stranded motorists, sex workers, and somehow Kibbe knew to go to the other side of the state where he continued to kill victims. Now, it's never been proven that his brother helped him. I just don't believe in coincidences. How are you able to be investigated 4 times for killing a 17-year-old in the same situation where she disappeared from an interstate, and when all these bodies are disappearing, you're not being tailed, you're not under 24-hour investigation? If it was somebody's family member in law enforcement or one of these agencies, I guarantee this would have stopped a long time ago. Remember that. They don't give a fuck until they have to give a fuck. And the sad part about it, it took some convict in protective custody to make this man feel just a tiny bit of fear like these ladies did. It took, in 1987, one of Roger Kibbe's victims to fight back. And as we know, these cowards, when somebody fights back, they usually get the shit beat out of them. They cower, they flee. And this lady fought back, fucked him up, scratched him up, got out the car while it was moving, flagged down a motorist, eventually a trooper. She told him what happened. They would pull him over. As they were pulling him over, they saw multiple things flying out of his car. It was Kibbe's killing kit: parachute wire, rope, scissors, and trophies from his many victims. This would lead to the arrest and conviction for the 17-year-old's murder that he was already being investigated for. He would later plead guilty for killing these 6 victims to what? Of course, avoid the death penalty. Because not only do they become victims when they enter prison and they don't have vulnerable women and children to prey on, they also all are scared to die because they're cowards. Later, in 2009, he confessed to an additional 6 murders where they're able to confirm them through the advances in DNA. He would get sentenced to life in prison as he again escaped the death penalty by admitting to where the bodies were and just saying, look, I'll say I did it. You got me. No trial, anything. I don't want to die. Well, the universe doesn't work like that. Meet psychopath Jason Boudreaux, who's also in protective custody and ultimately admitted to killing Roger Kibbe the same day he became his cellmate. Boudreaux went on to say, look, run it. Take me to trial. There is not one prosecutor or jury on this earth that'll ever sentence me to death for strangling the I-5 Strangler. Now, obviously, it's not funny. It just shows you that time truly doesn't exist in prison, only opportunity, as Roger Kibbe would be doing 27 years of his life sentence. Getting close to the end of his life at 71, 72 years old, he would be put in the cell with Jason Boudreaux, a psychopath, a maniac, who was also responsible for stabbing Paul Flores, Kristen Smart's killer. Now think about that. Roger Kibbe, at 71 years old, vulnerable, older, weaker, just like his victims that he overpowered, gets put in the cell, false sense of security, just like he did to his victims, where Boudreaux would go on to describe the murder. He said he got off the bunk. It took him months to manipulate Kibbe. Finally, Kibbe thought he was his friend. He would wait until the officers did their little rounds. As in protective custody, any lockdown units, you think that they would come check on you, but they don't. You could be in the cell for hours and hours with your cellmate, where he's viciously getting killed and beaten to death, and they won't find out until they have to feed you or do a mandatory count. That's exactly what happened here. Boudreaux, in a protective custody wing, I mind you, where they're supposed to check on the inmates every 15 minutes, got off the bunk, ended up putting Kibbe in a chokehold, strangling him, asking him to release his victims. And then, after he died, carve a pentagram in his chest. Yes, his exact words were, I killed Roger Kibbe the same day I became his cellmate. He called the killing a mission to avenge Kibbe's 7 victims, said he utilized the dark arts in the hopes that their souls will be free from the grasp of their killer. Think about that. Protective custody, and he had enough time to not only strangle him, not only talk some shit, but carve a pentagram in his chest. The biggest problem Boudreaux had was, quote, my narcissism cannot bear the idea that people would accept the notion I somehow lived with him, then had enough of him and just killed him one day. Hell no, Boudreaux wrote. He later referred to the killing as a human sacrificial offering. Basically saying, this whole time he was playing the game. Don't ever think I was his friend. I did this all to kill him and release the victims so he has no power over the families and the dead victims. He would later say, nobody will ever give me the death penalty for this. What, for strangling the I-5 serial killer? The man that strangled over 12 innocent women. He was right on that. He would get convicted for the murder of Roger Kibbe and the desecration of a corpse as he carved the pentagram in Roger Kibbe's chest. He would go on and say he spent months grooming Kibbe with the intent to murder him the entire time. Now, Boudreaux is no good as he has some bad charges, and a lot of times in protective custody, dudes will go after serial killers, some real notorious child molesters to try to get their name good, or some just want to give back to society. Some people get real religious, or they get offered some money to handle business. Protective custody, none of that matters. When it's your time, it's your time. A man that notoriously strangled, raped, murdered women up and down California, and even suspected for multiple murders in Pittsburgh, stays in prison in protective custody, where they kept him safe, begging him to admit to other murders. Then once he does, and they get as much as they can out of him, ironically, he gets put in the cell with a notorious killer, psychopath, who gets off the top bunk in a unit where they're supposed to check on the inmates every 15 minutes, strangles this 71-year-old serial killer who looks at him begging for his life. But these victims, they weren't given that opportunity. You chose them because they were vulnerable, they were weak, and you can overpower them. Those were his exact words. Go watch the interview on Mindhunters. It's on YouTube. Who ended up on a prison floor, carved up, strangled. Stay out, stay free, us.